Hi, everybody. Welcome to Accounting 667 Advanced Audit. This is Dr. Elaine Gregory, and this time we're going to talk a little bit about Chapter 2, which is who commits fraud and why, the profile and psychology of the fraudster. This is a very interesting section because it's one that we get information on, but you never know whether or not to trust it because a fraudster is just that, people who lie. So we don't know if when we try to profile them and understand them, if they are showing us their true side or their fraudster side. So let's get just some terminology down. You're going to be learning lots of new terms in this class. So think about these in the greater sense of how we're going to apply them in the future. So criminology is this a study of crime? Woohoo. And who criminals are and how crimes are committed. So it's just a general understanding of who's out there perpetrating this fraud and maybe what they're like. And you'll be surprised. They look just like us. So sometimes it's hard to see the fraudster until you get behind the scenes and find out their motivations. Occupational fraud and abuse. We talked a little bit about what occupational fraud was in our last chapter and all the different types of fraud that occurs. But basically, we consider it to be clandestine. It's hidden. It's secretive. It somehow violates some fiduciary duty of the organization, either by the employee who violates company policy or by the executive who violates it. Now, it could have a direct or an indirect financial benefit. Now, this is kind of the interesting part. Sometimes fraud is used to see for personal gain, direct benefit, but sometimes it is used as an indirect method, such as helping the company look better. Because if the company looks better, then maybe more shareholders will buy into it, or perhaps you're going to indirectly benefit from that through some type of compensation or benefit. And of course, it's always going to cost the organization in the assets, the theft or the misuse or the abuse of assets, revenues, either through financial misstatement of revenues or direct theft of revenues, or even reserves, where we have reserves set off that somehow get siphoned off and no one's watching the reserve store because we really don't. That's usually just a figure that's put into the balance sheet. We're going to reserve X amount of dollars, but we really haven't reserved them in the sense that we've taken that money and we've moved it someplace. We've just set it aside and said, okay, we're going to just earmark some money. We talk about this, and we're going to be talking about fraud and the fraud triangle and other different types of configurations of it. But as I said before in prior lectures, Donald Sutherland back in the 1940s started to coin the term white collar crime. And we looked at it because it was usually white males in executive positions or in well-respected professional positions who committed the crime. Now, it's now a free-for-all. It's not really necessarily white-collar crime so much anymore, but we still use that phrase because we can align it to that over something like robbery, where it's different. The term organizational crime usually is businesses that appear to be legitimate, or in fact, they are legitimate, but they're doing something illegal on the side. I worked once on a case that involved human trafficking, but the front of that was a legitimate business company. But what they were doing is that they were funneling the money that they were getting for the illegal trafficking through this company shell. So on the appearance, the company looked legitimate. It was a retail company. It was selling goods. But we could see that the money that was coming in just didn't fit to what sales were, or a decrease of that retail's inventory. So we figured out that that's how the money was being laundered through from the human trafficking. We have financial schemes, Ponzi schemes. Straight up Ponzi schemes is something like what Madoff pled guilty to. It really wasn't an investment company. It was just a straight up Ponzi scheme where they were taking new money and paying off old investors. And then there's these large corporate crimes that we saw back in the early 2000s, such as Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, that were just financial statement irregularities. Now, organized crime is different than organizational crime. Organized crime is crime that is done through wire fraud, money laundering, RICO laws, and organized crime is usually associated to some type of mafia or other type of mob type criminal organization, versus organized crime, which is a legitimate business that is committing crime. So let's think about this. Who commits these frauds and why? Well, if you've got the time, we can have any number of reasons for the pressures, the opportunity, and the rationalization. And it could be for any reason. It could be wanting better prestige, pressure to commit crime so that they have money to look better. I worked on a case where an investment broker was stealing money. And when she pled out in court, she said the reason why she did it is because she wanted to live the good life. And to live the good life, to attract other investors, she had to look the part. And to look the part took money. So she stole money from her investors and used that money to make herself look better. Sometimes lower level employees or even higher level employees will be dissatisfied with something within the job. Maybe they got passed over for a raise. Maybe they have some issues going on outside of the company, health issues, gambling issues, addiction issues. Maybe their spouse or partner lost their job, which can create that pressure outside the organization. When we talk about opportunity, usually it's poor internal controls, a lack of tone at the top, or management turning a blind eye. Those are usually the ways that opportunity exists. If you have a lack of segregation of duties, you open yourself up for somebody who is able to do maybe one of a multiple step process, and that can create the opportunity for fraud to exist. It could be management overriding or management coercion of an employee to change the numbers in the books for their own reasons and persons. We can usually find out incentives and pressures. We can usually find out a lot about opportunities for fraud. The rationalization becomes that hidden component, because we really don't know why a fraudster does what they do. Sometimes they tell the truth, sometimes they don't. It could be that everyone else was doing it. You fudged on your taxes because everybody else is doing it, and I'm such a low-level taxpayer that no one's going to catch me. Sometimes the incentive and the pressure correlate to the rationalization. I needed the money because my child has a health condition and insurance wasn't covering it. My spouse or my partner lost their job and we needed the extra income. So family health priorities sometimes play into that. Sometimes it's job dissatisfaction. They got passed over for a raise and they felt like they earned it, so they're going to go take it. And what I find is sometimes with some employees, they did not really intend to steal or commit fraud. They were just borrowing the money for just a short period of time, and then they were going to pay it back. In the report to the nations, and I'm going to be using this report all term long. So, like I said, if you're able to download a copy of it, please download a copy. I put it in the class resources for you. Very interesting information. Here are some of the major perpetrators of fraud. The owner and the executive. They can override management controls. They can fudge the books. They can change the numbers in the financials. The manager can do the same. And sometimes the manager has the incentive along with the owner executive because they are looking for that compensation based on benchmark achievements. 5% increase in revenue. Well, if you're at 4% increase in revenue and you get that bonus at 5%, what's the likelihood that you may feel the pressure either from your own personal gain of the bonus or making the company look good to increase that revenue percentage? And finally, employees. Now, employees are down at the bottom, but what we find is there are many more of those that are going on. There aren't a lot of the executives and managers committing the fraud, but they commit higher levels of fraud. Usually it's a lower level employee. More employees are committing a lower amount of fraud. And here, this is an interesting one, tenure. Now, we don't have a lot of people doing it in less than the first year because usually they don't know the system yet unless they understand the system going in. But otherwise, it takes them about a year or two to figure out the system, to figure out how to commit the fraud. You see the big jump between 1 and 5 years. They're probably at a middle level or low level position, entry level or middle level position. There may be segregation of duties issues. There may be weak internal controls. That's where we see more people committing the fraud. 6 to 10 years, it goes down to 25%. But the amount increases. So now we're starting to see that amount increasing where they have more opportunity to override controls. Maybe they have access to certain assets that other people don't, and those types of things. As we said, in the early days, white-collar crime was mainly white male executives, respected business people. Anymore, it's anybody. Anybody from the mailroom clerk that might steal checks that are coming in to the senior executive who is changing the data on the books. Now, we all know, or most of us know about the fraud triangle. We talked about it in chapter 1, and we're going to address it again in chapter 2. But since Donald Cressy created that fraud triangle back in the 40s and 50s, other models have been created which expand the measurements. For example, Albright identified multiple variables of the tenets, of those 3 tenets of pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. But they looked at it from the point of there's not a all or nothing, as Donald Cressy did, but rather there are levels or scales of probability. So Albright took the same 3 tenets, and sometimes these are called different. We talk about pressure, opportunity, rationalization, motivation, rationalization, opportunity. Albricht's version called it concealment, conversion, and the act. Same thing. But what he did, or what Albright did, is change it from just this black and white version of the fraud triangle to more of the sliding scale, showing, depending on the personal integrity of that person, the opportunity to commit the fraud, and the situational pressures that existed, could shift the ability for someone to commit fraud, or the likelihood. So someone maybe with a low situational pressure, a, a high personal integrity, would probably have a very low ability or low desire to commit fraud. So as the scale moved, we saw these other variables come into play. As that model was created, we were also seeing other ones coming in. Wolf and Hermanson created what they called the fraud diamond. It still looked at the incentive, rationalization, and opportunity, but it also added one more identifying character, and that was capability. You might have the opportunity of the inadequate internal controls. The question is, did you have enough capability or knowledge of the system to commit the fraud? So they said, while there is all this incentive and rationalization and opportunity, they have to be capable of committing the fraud. It has to be there and present for them with their skill knowledge to be able to commit the fraud. Very interesting. And it kind of showed a little bit on the employee side why fraud was being committed. Now, Marx came up with what they called Crow's fraud pentagon, and that created two other levels besides opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. It talked about arrogance and competence. Competence kind of shifted a little bit towards capability. Am I competent enough in my job to commit the fraud and not get caught? But arrogance came in, which is now very subjective. And we're looking more at, instead of rationalization, pressure, opportunity, and competence, those are hard skills, hard variables. We're now looking at a soft variable called arrogance. And that means we have to start looking at the behavior of the person, or the behavior, the arrogance of the organization. And that kind of goes back to culture. So when we think of culture of the organization, or what role does the organization play in all this fraud stuff? Because it can't always just be the person. Sometimes the organization sets itself up for failure. It could be that we have employee behaviors that are counterproductive. You have disgruntled, low morale. You have sick leave abuse. You have all these other symptoms. And remember, when we talk about getting into the engagement of a fraud, we have to weed through those symptoms to find what the problem is. And the problem could be poor employee behavior. Perhaps employees are not satisfied with their jobs. We know that now, as companies are limiting their staff, they're becoming leaner in their staff. Employees are burdened with more work, but they aren't necessarily given more pay. They feel like they've been wronged, or they haven't been treated fairly, so they are going to rectify that. It could be, as we said, complete organization issues, failure of good policies, failure of hiring the right people. Are you vetting out your people correctly? Are you doing appropriate background checks on people who have the opportunity to become in concert with assets of the organization? Do you have sound inventory control, or is inventory walking out the back of the store? Do you have good security? And security means passwords, it means locks on doors, and it also means being vigilant by management. And do you have adequate punishment when they are caught perpetrating the crime? Just whitewashing it and letting the person go, or having them pay it back, does not change the person's behavior, nor does it change the organization. It just allows it to continue, and it will continue and mushroom. So what they've found in studies is the more active and engaged management is, vigilant they are, the likely there is going to be a reduction to the risk of fraud that's occurring. So more management awareness could be aligned to a likely reduction of risk. Now let's take a look at some statistics regarding the role of the organization. As we said, if there is more vigilance, if there is more tone at the top, if there is more anti-fraud controls, you could reduce the risk of fraud and you could detect fraud quicker if you have adequate balances and checks going on. We see that 29% of the cases are due to either a lack of internal controls, and there are 5 major sets of internal controls. You may have great internal controls, great segregations of duties, great administrative oversight, but if you're not monitoring your books and records, there you go. You could have a risk of fraud occurring still. Or there is an override of the existing controls, and the override could appear anywhere. I remember working on a fraud where we knew the person had done it, but we could not prove it. It was at a bank. The person was identified as stealing money from people's accounts, usually wealthy retirees. We found that that person catered to those wealthy retirees more than others and handled their books and records more than others. But what we also found was that in order for that person to avoid being convicted, they allowed others to use their password into the computer system. So while we knew that password had accessed the system when the crime was committed, we could not tie the password access to the person because everyone used everybody's password. They would jump on each other's computers if they needed to help out, and there was an override of the controls. Now, on the left side is a screenshot of what anti-fraud controls are most common. Audits are the most common, but I will tell you that audits do not result in identifying fraud in most cases. But we can see that there's a lot of different controls that we can use, such as using a hotline, support programs, proactive data monitoring, that an organization can implement that could reduce the risk of fraud losses. Now that we've looked at the organization, let's look at the psychology of the fraudster. I'm not going to get deep into psychology because I'm not a psychologist, but the text points out some very interesting characteristics that we could look at. The first thing that the text calls out is what they call the mice motivations. And any one of these could be in play when a fraud occurs. The more motivations you have, the likelier the fraud is going to occur at a greater risk. The M stands for money, greed. I also think about that as need as well as greed. There's a need for money. There could be an ideology involved. You are doing it because of a belief that you have. Terrorist financing is one of those, where money is being stolen or money is being laundered to help terrorist organizations. There could be coercion involved. Management to employee coercion. I will give you a bonus that you desperately need, but I want you to look the other way at the end of the quarter. Believe it or not, it happens. You're unwillingly pulled into that fraud. Sometimes in the executive level, there's the ego entitlement or the power play that goes on. I believe, after understanding and reading about Bernie Madoff, as well as Kenneth Lay from Enron, that ego and entitlement were very much prevalent, that power play. during the Bernie Madoff time, it came out that people were literally throwing their money at him, and he would step back and go, no, 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 I'm not going to take your money, I'm not going to invest your money. And there would be so much pressure by that person to give that money to Mr. Madoff that it became very much a power status. If you were not investing with Bernie Madoff, you were losing out on everything. And in fact, it turned out you lost everything. There are two types of fraud that we look at when it comes to the psychology of fraud. One is the situational fraud, and that's where it happens by accident. Say you are responsible for taking the nightly deposit to the bank and you put it in your purse and you go home instead and you totally forget. And then Monday morning, you look in your purse and, oh my gosh, that money is there. The deposit never went in. But no one said anything. There was no follow-up. There was no one saying, can I get the deposit slip from you, from the deposit from Friday, and now it's Monday. And so the situation kind of created that fraud. And usually those are what we call the accidental fraudsters. They might be a first-time offender. They're undoubtedly a good person. They just kind of forgot. And then they went, wow, it's been 2 weeks and no one has said anything. That could lead you to become more of a predator fraudster. So situational fraudsters can oftentimes become predators, and predators are what they are. They've committed it before. They probably have committed it in other organizations. It's never come to anybody's surface of understanding. I was involved in a fraud with a payroll clerk who came in as an expert on a payroll system. And that person was very, very good at it. And so we said, great, you set up the payroll system. Had all these administrative rights because they were setting it up. Was planning on doing some vacation time. So they said, let's just bring somebody in as backup. Just teach them how to put the payroll in. That's it. They asked me to do that. And so I volunteered and I said, show me how to do it. The person was very gracious, gave me a little operating manual. We went through, we put in all the payroll for the employees, printed out all the reports, printed out checks, did all this great stuff. Person went on vacation. I ran the payroll by myself, looked at the report, and the person who taught me said, just don't look at the report. Just punch it, put it in the book. I'll look at it when I get back. You don't have to do all that. Let's just get the checks out. Cool. But I decided to look at the report because I was curious about that. And lo and behold, I found phantom employees, people that did not exist. And all the checks were going to the same address, which happened to be that payroll person's address. Well, after that person voluntarily terminated from the organization, they quit before we could prosecute them. We found out that this person had been doing this in other organizations, but they couldn't say anything because they quit beforehand. And since you couldn't prove that that person committed the fraud, you couldn't say, well, we think that person stole from us, because that's character assassination. So sometimes predators will actively seek out companies to defraud because they know what they're doing. This person was very good at one specific payroll system. So I'm sure that person went to another company after that worked in that payroll system and repeated the same thing. Not all frauds are committed by one person. Oftentimes they are committed by a group, and a group of two or more is considered collusion. You're helping each other. There are multiple predators working together in tandem. And it could be someone such as you are the payroll clerk and you have a friend in human resources who creates dummy employees, and you put that information into the system. You create these dummy employee checks and you split the profits. It could be that you work with an outside vendor, little quid pro quo coming on. You let them know when a contract is coming up and you advise them on an appropriate price of that contract. They get the bid, they win the award, and you split the difference. So it can be done internally or externally in an organization. They're usually very short duration, but for large dollar amounts. And we know that there really is no honor among thieves. All you need is one of your partners within the collusion to turn on the rest. Now, in the report to the nations, we can see that as of 2022, the number of perpetrators, 42% was one perpetrator with a median loss of $57,000. So they stole approximately $57,000 during their time as a fraudster. But if you look at the two predators, that may go down to 20%, but you can see that the median loss raises. And three or more, it goes even higher. So you are gaining more by getting more perpetrators involved. And it becomes much more difficult to trace these types of frauds because you may have people inside the organization and outside. Now let's talk about the court system just very briefly. Courts are very difficult when it comes to discussing fraud because fraud may be extremely complex. So a lot of times people rely on the fraud triangle to explain how the fraud took place, which is fine. However, the courts don't like you to use theories. So you kind of have to take the theory of the fraud triangle and use it down into concepts that are illustrated through the actual who did it, how they did it, and then you sometimes have to suppose why they did it. One thing we want to warn people against, and this can come up and trick you during a court case, as an accountant or as a fraud examiner, you are merely talking about the events that took place and the underlying transactions that caused the events to take place. One, you cannot determine that fraud occurred. You can state that there are irregularities within the system that could have contributed to the risk of fraud, but you really can't say that fraud could occur because that's really for the courts to decide. You are just providing the evidence and the rationale and the analysis of the evidence that points to the irregularity. The second thing, what I've seen in colleagues that sometimes slip up in court is that they try to get into the head of the fraudster. We are not psychologists. We don't know why they did what they did. They can tell us, I needed the money for X, I needed the money for Y, I'm justifying my rationale because of whatever. But they're liars because they're fraudsters. So we don't know if they're really telling us the truth. Every year I attend the ACFE annual fraud conference. It's a 3 to 5 day long conference, depending on what you want to do. But at the end of the main conference, they always have a fraudster that appears without compensation to talk about what they did, how they did, and why they did it. And they're very good at telling us what they did. We know because they've usually been in the headlines. We understand how they did it because we are fraud examiners or forensic accountants, so we can follow the trail that they're discussing. But when it comes to the why, that's the part that we don't always believe. Because in their mind, they're trying to rationalize it to make it okay for them to have done it. Some will admit that they did the fraud, that they stole, but they'll they'll tell us for different reasons. So don't try to get into the head of the fraudster, because usually that's just not a very trustworthy place to go. There's a basic model, it's called the meta model, that we can use. And that meta model can show us all the issues that are associated with a particular fraud. The good thing is this meta model can be used against different fraud models. So we can take different fraud models and plug them in and come out with the same outcome. And let's take a look at this. Here we have the top, the fraud triangle, which is 3 variables that leads us to the absence of the anti-fraud measures, the anti-fraud mechanisms, and the triangle of the Fraud Act. So we can go through here from the fraud triangle. We can look at the prevention, detection, and perceptions and look at how the crime was committed. We can take this same meta model and apply it to Crow's fraud pentagram. And we can use the same types of measurements and come out with the same concealment, conversion, and the act of the crime. So what this tells us is even if we've got the fraud scale, the fraud pentagon, the fraud diamond, the fraud hexagram now, we can apply that model to these different anti-fraud measures and come up with the same type of investigation process. Any questions? Post them into the class questions. You can post a Halo message, or you can reach out to me through Calendly. And as Warren Buffett said in 1997, it's been far safer to steal large sums with a pen than small sums with a gun. And we can see that. We can see the amount of fraud that can be perpetrated simply by manipulating numbers with the pen. Have a great week. Reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the classroom.